Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are joining us today. I'm very pleased to be joined by esteemed panelists who will be sharing with us today their views and on the topic about financial resilience and social safety. My name is Ziba Askar. I'm the head of banking and finance at the Bahrain Institute of Banking and Finance, and I myself am a speaker in regards to sustainable development. And normally, when I speak about this topic, I address the ESGs, the environmental, social, and governance. Whenever I talk about environmental, I speak about the extent of losses incurred as a result of extreme weather conditions, natural disasters. Whenever I talk about governance, I speak about the financial losses incurred, especially in 2008. And when I speak about social aspect, I often refer to what happened as a result of COVID, which is the topic that we will be addressing today. So when it comes to COVID and the impact it had, it really affected the safety of human beings, and it affected governments and economies all over the world. So funds that were previously directed towards growth were directed towards health and well-being. And when over 193 countries came together back in 2015 and they signed the Sustainable Development Goals, progress that have been made on addressing the goals and particularly poverty, they were actually they were undone, and decades of progress on poverty and disease were kind of undone. So in today's session, we will be discussing the impact of COVID, particularly on the households and the families, and what kind of lessons have been learned and what kind of opportunities can be identified. And I would like to start today's session by asking the panelists to introduce themselves. So I will start by the names as I see them on my screen. So I'll start by Andrea.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm I'm Andrea Hazler. I'm assistant research professor in financial literacy at the George Washington University School of Business. So we are located here in Washington, D.C. That's why you also see it's quite dark in the background with me. It's morning. But I'm also deputy academic director at the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center, or in short, GFLEC. So GFLEC is one of the leading research centers in financial literacy globally, as our name says, and I'm heading the team of researchers. So, and my research is dedicated to financial literacy, capability, with the most recent focus on young women and historically underrepresented communities. And because of COVID-19, the crisis, we have been working a lot on topics about financial fragility, anxiety, and stress. So I will be talking, and I brought a couple of stats with me today to this presentation, and you will hear a little bit more what's going on, especially here in the US, but we see with our global data that this is happening or has been happening around the world. So we are also building programs and advising organizations on initiatives that aim to increase financial literacy levels. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea. Dr. Gustavo, if you can please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be again joining the Arab Pension and another edition of the Arab Pension Conference. This time in a virtual format. My name is Gustavo De Marco. I am the global lead for pensions and social insurance at the World Bank. I think everybody knows the World Bank, so I will not need to do a long introduction. It's one of the agencies that has been providing the broadest and deepest and biggest support in the COVID times, also on a regular basis to social protection and social insurance and other areas of development. So I'm part of the social protection of the social protection team, while I mostly deal with social insurance. I'm also working closely with my colleagues working on social safety nets and cash transfers.
Introduce yourself.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for FinTech Robuste for the invitation and for the opportunity to give us to participate in this very important panel. I am so pleased to participate with panelists to this session. I am Fatima Zahra Aziz. I am Executive Director of the Moroccan Foundation for Financial Education. A few words about the foundation. It is for non-profit organization created at initiative of the Central Bank in Morocco. The board is composed by the governor of Central Bank as president, and also all concerned institutions by financial inclusion and financial education in Morocco, such as Ministry of Economic and Finance, Ministry of National Education, and so on. And also the particularity is that this foundation federates private and public institutions, such as the Federation of Banks, of Insurance Companies, and Microfinance Association, and so on. We have also the regulators, the Central Bank, and also the Authority of Supervision of Insurance, and also the Moroccan Authority for Capital Markets. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima and Sandrine.
Yes, hello everybody, and I'm delighted to join such esteemed speakers on the panel. My name is Sandrine Bardot. I'm French, but I am based in Dubai. I'm representing the employee and the employer side on this panel. I'm a consultant in Total Rewards. So within human resources, we look after the compensation and the benefits of employees, including, anything that has to do with social security, healthcare, pensions, and well-being, which also includes financial well-being. So I'll try to bring my perspective to the debate today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for the introduction. So I will start with my first discussion point, and I would like to address this to Andrea and Dr. Gustavo. So based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic needs at the bottom of the hierarchy are the physiological needs, and they are followed by the safety needs. So these core foundations were actually shaken as a result of COVID, where the world went into chaos in the beginning. And I'm just taking you back at the initial days when things started to happen. And there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of unknown. Some people were even thinking this is never going to end, where our life is never going to go back to normal. So the question here is twofold. How would you describe, in your opinion, how the pandemic affected the household financial decision-making? And what was the economic impact around the world as a result of that? So we'll start with you, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to start answering this question with showing how prepared people were to face the pandemic. Because if you think we need to have some sort of benchmark by answering that question to see what was the state, how well prepared were people before we actually entered the pandemic. And as I already mentioned before, I'll throw a couple of stats around here. So we found with nationally representative data that more than 50% of Americans, this is now related to America here, did not have any rainy day funds to cover 3 months of expenses. And if you think during the lockdowns of the pandemic, so many were laid off or couldn't find a new job because everything was shut down. So really 50% didn't have any cushion to cover a loss in income. Then also around 30% said in our surveys that they wouldn't be able to cope with a $2,000 financial shock within a month. So our question basically leaves open what sources people can tap into, and we say they have an entire month to come up with $2,000 to cover a financial shock, and 1 out of 3 person here said that they wouldn't be able to actually cover that. And if you think that doesn't really need savings in your bank account, that also can mean that you can sell something, or you can tap into a network of family and friends, or even use your credit card or another outstanding line of credit that's available to you. So that shows a little bit, just with a few stats, how ill-prepared people and how financially fragile people were even before we entered the pandemic. And on the other side, you also mentioned psychological part. Here, I actually have a question in our surveys that asked about financial anxiety and stress. And we see that even before the pandemic, 60% said that they feel anxious when they think about their personal finances. That's 60%. So that really shows how stressed people were about their finances. And now you can just imagine what happened when the entire pandemic started. So that's just a couple of stats. And when I actually look at the data now, I also have data during the pandemic, and we looked at the same indicators or the same variables that I just mentioned, we see actually similar results compared to pre-pandemic levels, and which was at first surprising, but then it was actually also quite clear that this is a result of, and most likely driven by the federal government financial relief efforts that were put in place in the US here, and that included stimulus payment. So, and also various other expansions of safety net programs. So that really helped. That money that was given to the people really helped ease families' immediate financial distress and inability to cover expenses. But now, of course, in the long term, we have to carefully observe what's going to happen, because the lack of emergency savings and also high debt levels have not resolved. So that will likely continue imposing pressure on households' future budgets and financial resilience.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple of important points. I believe the rainy day funds and how unprepared they were even before the pandemic, and probably the shock of the pandemic that came made the thing even worse. So, Dr. Gustavo, on the same question, and as a follow-up on one of the points that Andrea mentioned regarding the government stimulus packages and then the risk relief programs that were put in place. So, how do you think overall the economic impact of this was on the world?
Thank you. To start framing the answer to your question, I would like to propose that we focus on several angles to look at the losses of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, and I will start by the obvious, the unpreparedness of the people and the institutions worldwide led to losses in income, but also losses in productivity and losses in human capital. And I think this is a framework I would like to propose and use, because not only people were affected in their flow of income, but which of course affected differentially some groups as opposed to other groups, but also there were losses in productivity. Not everybody was equally prepared to continue working during the pandemics. Working remotely was an option for many workers. It was not an option for many other workers, and these were the ones that were most severely hit by the pandemic because they either couldn't continue working or they worked with lower productivity levels. But I have to say that even for those workers who could continue working from home and kept their jobs and had regular incomes, the productivity, they were also affected by productivity loss. Let's just think about the challenge of managing work and family life, and at the same time families with children at home trying to support their remote education at the same time as they were trying to comply with their work-related obligations. So this is something we are not talking too much about, but I think we need to also focus not only on the people who lost their jobs, who lost their regular incomes, who lost the sources of income for their families, which is the most compelling need, but at the same time, those who lost their productivity with some potential long-term impacts, and finally the losses of human capital, children, undereducated children, or not well-educated children, because technology was available in many parts of the world, but it was also not equally available in all countries. So there are countries where the access to technology was much more limited and where the quality of education suffered. And health, definitely at the end of the day, health was the main concern and driver of the actions, of the public actions. So these affected not only the people who suffered pandemics, but also who suffered COVID, but also those people who, for several reasons, could not have access to proper health care, to the elderly who are a vulnerable group, and where long-term care services showed their limitations, and also for persons with disabilities who were also marginally affected differentially. The lack of preparedness, not only, I would like to also highlight, in addition to the lack of preparedness of the individuals and family, the insufficient preparedness of the programs. The most effective response to the COVID-19 pandemics was in countries where existing programs could be upscaled. As many of you may know, the World Bank provided a massive support to cash transfer programs worldwide. But some countries had more developed institutions, more developed programs than others. And of course, it was easier to upscale programs when the countries had something in place than when the countries did not have something in place. The social insurance is a particular chapter because almost every social insurance program worldwide was unprepared to provide any response to the kind of shocks associated with the pandemics. Maybe by design, but in some cases, there are countries where existing programs could have supported unemployment in a better way. As opposed to this, they had to use the pension funds, which is a long-term savings mechanism, to try to compensate for the lack of short-term programs or medium-term programs to support the unemployed. Let me stop here.
Thank you. You touched upon a couple of important points. So normally we speak about the loss of income, the direct the people who are losing their jobs, but maybe highlighting the element of productivity is also something important that we need to think about more. And also when you mentioned about access, so the concept of inclusivity and technology being available is also, these are also things that are important. For example, a number of individuals, they don't even know how to use basic technology and be able to, for example, access their bank accounts if they had bank accounts. So this is also going to be affecting the preparedness, which could be either due to possibly lack of knowledge or literacy, or at some point you see that there is a struggle with execution. So this takes me to the next discussion point. There's a difference, a very kind of subtle difference between reacting and responding. And reacting can be impulsive, it can be not well thought about, but when you respond, you are more calculative, and it comes from a place of knowledge, it comes from a place of awareness. And so in your opinion, and this is addressed to, I'll start with Sandrine and then Fatma. So in your opinion, do you think that the way the households and the individuals, I would say, reacted to the pandemic was connected or related to their level of financial literacy, to their knowledge? And also I'll follow up on what Dr. Gustavo said, how was the level of their preparedness?
So I'm French and I'm based in Dubai, so I'm probably going to answer from both point of view. I have been reading that in France, actually, we saw record levels of savings by the French people during the COVID, which in my opinion had to do with recent education about economic crisis about 12 years ago when we had the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, where people had to figure out that they need to save money in order to be able to sustain themselves for a long time, but also in France by very good social security and complementary measures and even government-sponsored enhancements to a loss of income through loss of jobs. So I think that from that point of view, people maybe responded more than reacted by being maybe a bit less panicky and trying to reduce their spending. In the Gulf countries where I am based, we don't have any kind, if you're an expatriate, or if you're not a national of those countries, you have no social security, no unemployment cover, nothing whatsoever. But what happened is that we saw that the governments had learned from the crisis of 2008. And so, for example, when companies were saying we have to cut your income, the government said, for example, in the UAE, but you cannot cut the housing allowance, which is what allowed people to stay with a roof over their head, especially as they were blocked and could not leave the country to go back to their home country and their family if they wanted to. And so we saw that there was this kind of mix of reaction of people reducing their spending in response to the situation. It was very visible. The only places where people were spending money was the supermarket, and all the rest of the shops was really not selling much. So I think that people were more careless because they also did not understand how long the crisis would last, and so they wanted to make any penny last. And I would say also in the Gulf countries, a lot of people send money back home to their families, so they were kind of split between, taking care of themselves where they were and also trying to support their family back home. So that made them, I think, be very cautious in how they were spending. So not panicking, trying to plan as much as possible. That would be my perception.
Thank you, Sandrine. Fatima, I will ask you the same question, and I think maybe you can also share with us some of the Moroccan experience in this regard.
Thank you, Ziba. As said by my colleagues, the pandemic crisis has affected the world with consequences both on health and finances. I think that nobody was really prepared for a crisis of this magnitude. The number of financially illiterate persons around the world is unfortunately not very high, and these people are mainly in developed economies and countries. So, in fact, the pandemic crisis has revealed the vulnerability of people to different degrees and depending on the country's social and economic situation, and also, of course, of the level of people awareness and financial capabilities. Regarding your question, Ziba, yes, I think that financial literacy can make the difference both in terms of preparation and anticipation of to shocks, and also the way to handle or respond to their situation, to make wise and responsible financial decision when we are faced to the context as such as the pandemic crisis. We have also observed the emergence of new vulnerable populations due to the lockdown period. Colleagues spoke about that, distancing measures, business closure, and so on. The long duration in this crisis made the situation more complicated for people, and also the uncertainty and unknown situation. It will be here for how many time, for how many years and months. Truly, I think that the crisis has highlighted the need for urgent and sustainable action to mitigate the economic impact of the pandemic, protect mostly vulnerable populations, and prepare for sustainable recovery. For that, at the foundation and in this perspective of increasing households and entrepreneurs' financial resilience in order to reduce their vulnerability, at the Moroccan Foundation for Financial Education, we aim to strengthen and preserve the population financial skills. We have had to adapt our financial strategy and also our plan, and to redefine priorities with regard to this new context. As a matter of fact, we faced several challenges, such as the change in the population financial literacy need. We observe new needs and new population targeted, and also priorities in the topics to be addressed, and also the way and channel to use. We know that in the period of lockdown and also with the distancing measures, we cannot organize training, face-to-face training or session of awareness, but we have to use mostly digital or radio channel to disseminate financial concept and messages. So we also try to accompany and support this vulnerable population in terms of the use of digital financial services. We know that in several countries, the state and the government gave ads to people. In the period of lockdown, most of these people cannot deserve the ads and don't know to use the digital financial services. So we have to support them in this period by giving them information and knowledge about this. We also we also redefine our action plan to set up immediately action, such as two campaigns, awareness campaign, one digital on our social media, the foundation social media, but also all stakeholders, and also on radio. So we launched these two awareness campaigns in the objective to raise households and entrepreneur awareness and to develop their knowledge of various financial concepts required, especially in this context. Also, we accelerated the development of new educational resources and the delivery of our e-learning program for, especially for entrepreneurs, very small businesses, I mean. We also deal with new and develop new topics such as insurance for entrepreneurs, mobile payment, and also cash flow management, and so on. We support mainly entrepreneurs in terms of how to prepare the recovery, how to make a diagnostic for their businesses, and how to find financing for their needs to recover their businesses and activity. Now we continue developing financial education content and materials in line with the new needs and expectation of targeted population, and also to conduct permanent campaign, raising campaign for all targeted and priority population. I will stop here.
Thank you, Fatma, for sharing all of this. And you did bring up a couple of points. For example, the digital financing, which I believe it was there before the pandemic, but the pandemic helped push it even more. And for it even a bigger deal, it pushed literacy, the digital literacy, and it kind of forced people to start using it. And more importantly, the point about financial resilience. So financial resilience comes with the concept of to what extent people can weather changing conditions. And this brings me to my next question for Andrea and Gustavo, which is, when it comes, and that's a basic question, but I think it's too basic that it's often overlooked. So the difference between what is a necessity and what is a luxury, the difference between a want and a need. And when the time came for the pandemic, especially if we go back to the point of anxiety, chaos, uncertainty, in your opinion, do you think this has impacted consumers' behavior during that period? Did it affect the way they save and spend money? Perhaps Andrea, you can start.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, I definitely believe that consumer behavior has changed because of the pandemic, and not just the consumer. Also, if you think about employers and policymakers, so everybody became more aware that it's not only important to save for retirement, but also to have that cushion, to have short-term savings, right? To have emergency savings, because as I mentioned before, 50% do not have, they not have anything that they can draw from during this crisis. So I think that's definitely something. And traditionally, workplaces and workplace financial wellness programs, especially here in the US, have heavily focused on retirement savings. So I really believe that this vision has changed, and not just for the consumer, but also among employers and policymakers, and that a more holistic approach is needed when it comes to programs that aimed at helping people build their financial well-being and resilience. And one point that I'd like to make here as well, that goes hand in hand with financial or consumer behavior is what Fatima mentioned before, is the low financial literacy that we see around the world. Because what we see is that financial literacy is highly linked to good money management behavior. So that's what we see here, or what we saw over the past 18 months as well, that those who had higher financial literacy were in general better able to cope with financial shocks and less worried about making ends meet, and also less anxious and stressed about their personal finances. So there is this really strong connection between financial literacy and money management behavior. And as Fatima mentioned, and I have actually data from a big study that we did together in collaboration with the World Bank and Gallup, and it was back in 2014, but it is actually the most comprehensive and largest global data collection that we did. So 148 countries were surveyed, and we found that around the globe only 1/3 of adults, so 1 out of 3, are seen as financially literate, and that's far too little to navigate such an environment where there is so much uncertainty, and we really have to navigate a landscape. And you mentioned it's not just all the health and questions that we were facing and changes in income, but it was also how to use new tools like digital personal finance tools, or access to your bank account, because the bank was closed, so you had to do it from your home, from your browser. And that's something where we need digital literacy alongside financial literacy to navigate that complex field and environment.
Thank you, Andrea. I just want to remind the audience that there is a poll that is coming shortly, and if you can please answer that so that we can discuss it during the session. So Dr. Gustavo, now back to you for the same question regarding how the pandemic affects consumer behaviors.
Well, I think the question is not addressed probably to the right person, because I'm not an expert on consumer behavior. But some of the issues that are being discussed, and particularly the financial literacy or financial preparedness of people, and the use of technology have implications on other areas that I know better. That is more related with family, with long-term planning, and with better preparedness for different risks associated with shocks. I think we have known, as Andrea said, from quite long ago, that financial literacy is low worldwide, and that this affects many savings instruments, such as those that are more linked with present consumption, but also with future consumption, which is the objective of some social insurance schemes in general. I would also point to the fact that this preparedness again is not only a matter of individual preparedness, but also a matter of better provision of public programs to support people cope with different sources of risk. And what the COVID crisis has shown is that the social protection programs need to have a very strong focus on protecting the poorest as the most vulnerable groups of the population, but also that other groups became vulnerable because the focus of the program was not intended for certain risks or for certain groups of people. Typically, we speak more now about the integration of social insurance programs. So what we faced during the crisis was that even those people who had some savings provision for the long term, they didn't have savings provisions for shocks. So that is, the response to old age is uneven worldwide, is low worldwide, but is better than the support to short-term shocks. And in the end, what happened was that people had to use long-term savings to provide for short-term shocks. Why? Because, thanks to the awareness of many pension programs in the past 20 or 30 years, many people had savings for retirement or funds for retirement, but they didn't have funds for unemployment or a shock that would affect their regular flow of income. So one of the lessons that I think COVID-19 has left is that it's not only working on the individual's capacity to plan, but also on a proper policy framework of integrated programs that can help people cope with different types of risks. The financial literacy implications of some decisions that have been taken during the crisis may also have long-term implications. People have been withdrawing funds from their savings accounts precisely because there was no provision for savings for a situation of shock or for unemployment. And this has depleted the long-term savings of many people. So it's now the time for public policies to complement what people understand about the ways to compensate for those decisions that were taken during the crisis in order to avoid the poverty in the old age. Many people who had some level of savings, in some cases low, in some cases middle level of long-term savings, have used those savings to cope for the crisis because there was no unemployment insurance or savings for shocks, and are at the risk of becoming poor in the old age. So how to compensate? There are mechanisms to compensate, but they need to be supported because the individuals by themselves will not be able to fix this.
You touched upon a couple of important points, which I would probably come back to later, because especially the part about the short-term planning versus the long-term. And I think with the shock of the pandemic and maybe even the length that it took or the duration of it, so it wasn't for a short period, it is still also ongoing by now. So it has taken pretty long. And even if there were some reserves intended for kind of emergencies and crises, I don't think they would have been for such a length of time. So maybe we'll come back to this in a bit. So I'll go to Sandrine now, and I want to ask you about the employees, since you come from that background. And how did the pandemic really affect them, especially that it is connected with the question that the poll is raising? So in terms of, for example, what employees were going through, like for their job security, their well-being. Some of them were struggling with uncertainty. They didn't feel safe going to their works. So how did this affect them? And how did the companies deal with them? And how did the HR practices change? Did it affect training? Are the trainings changing? So I'd like to hear your views on this.
Okay, so maybe I will start by talking about what I think has been quite a difference in how employers, generally speaking, have reacted to this crisis compared to the 2008-2009 crisis, for example. We saw that there has been quite a lot of learning that was done from the previous crisis from the part of the employers. Employers communicated with their employees much better about the reality of the situation, the kind of decisions that they were going to have to make, and so on. There was, I think, less of a knee-jerk reaction, like in the past was like, oh, crisis, let's fire all the employees. I think this time employers were trying to keep their employees as much as they could. They tried to look into reducing pay, furlough, which is like, okay, I can't pay you, but I keep your contract so that you can keep, your health insurance and all this kind of stuff. So there was a more considerate, I would say, reaction from a lot of employers. We also saw that there was more leadership, by example, in some companies where the executives took a much bigger pay cut than the regular employees and so on. And that had, despite the stress, despite the shock and everything, I think for those organizations that reacted this way, a kind of soothing effect on their employees, in the sense that it did not cut the anxiety about losing your job. It did not cut it, but I think it did not multiply it like what might have happened in organizations that were not reacting in a very mature way. So from an employee point of view, what we see as I'm an HR professional, that employees have those who stayed in the job are really going through a number of things, and there is more request and more need for a number of things coming from the employer, and they all compound. The first one is the quality of the healthcare cover that the employee receives, and that includes mental health, which in many locations was a big taboo. And I think that even though we're talking about financial security, it's important to talk about the mental health and the resilience of people, because that's a big factor in how one reacts to the crisis. We also saw that people were becoming more aware of proper need for, support in terms of child care and also elder care for those intergenerational households. And we also see that employees are asking for more financial well-being solutions. So, support for in terms of education and awareness, obviously. So it's great to see that there are so many initiatives taking place. And to help people understand, what is debt, what is credit card debt, how do I manage my budget, why do I need to have that savings for the emergency, it's important, should be the first one that we build, and so on. And this is really important because when people are stressed, whatever the reason, we all know that it has a massive impact on the capacity of the employee to focus on their work. It has an impact on their engagement, therefore an impact on productivity, an impact on outcome, and even an impact on the people around them, because it's like stress is a little bit contagious, so it's very, very important. As a reaction, what we have seen is that employers are putting in place more programs that are focused on mental well-being, financial well-being, and education, better healthcare support, mental health care. And so we really see that this has impacted how organizations think beyond what they need to provide to the employees, not just pay. It goes above and beyond, because they're really starting to approach the employee as a whole in a holistic manner. So you were asking about training. I think it's the education about finances, the education about resilience. It has been, all those companies that were sharing videos for people to continue to be more moving while they were locked at home, and so on. And I would say, however, that as much as initially a lot of people had a lot of anxiety about losing their job and so on, we're seeing in the last few months a complete reversal of the situation. Some of you might have heard of this great resignation, which is a massive voluntary exodus of employees who are resigning, sometimes without having another job in hand, because the time that COVID took away from us in terms of the amount of time that we were having social activity and family activities, and I don't know, sports outside, going to the restaurants, going to the movies and so on, gave people time to think and reassess what they want from life. And what we see is that there are two main types of people who are leaving. So there were 4.3 million people who left voluntarily the workforce in the US in August, and again in September 4.2 or 4.3 or 4.4 million. I mean, it's huge numbers. And we see a lot of people who are on the jobs where you would think that they would try to hold on to their job because maybe they're less well paid and they might have more financial difficulty. So, you know, jobs, people who work in the food and beverage industry, in the retail, in hospitality. And actually, those people leave because they want to move for better work conditions and a better pay, better support from their employer, better working hours, better work conditions. And we also see a huge amount of people leaving on the other end of the spectrum, highly skilled people, most notably, you know, in tech, digital, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on, who have lots of opportunities because all companies are trying to reorganize themselves towards being more digital. And so it's kind of interesting to see this kind of contrast between a situation where employees were panicked and holding on to their job last year, where at the same period, 1 year later, a sizable number of them, I'm not saying it's all of them, a sizable number of people. We have various surveys which say that 50% of employees are considering to leave their employer in the coming 6 to 12 months. There was a big Microsoft one where it was about 36% of the employee population, others 41, others 50. In any case, it's a big amount of people who are considering leaving their employer. And it's a complete reversal. And I think that people have also learned that despite the difficulty, despite the financial hardship and so on, they needed to take care of themselves and to go for what they want to achieve in life, and that they should be able to take risks. And I think, especially in the US, because there were extra payments from the federal government compared to the local unemployment, that allowed some people to do a little bit of savings. You know, everybody kind of reduced their spending, tried to save more money, and to gain that kind of freedom to be able to search for a better opportunity. So I'm hoping that I know that it's not for everybody, but that something good was able to come out of this crisis that we've gone through and we're still going through in some cases.
Very, very interesting points you have raised here, because you know, sometimes I think that they say that anything that costs you your peace is just way too expensive. And I think people during the COVID time, when they were in a position fearing their own safety, their family safeties, even their values and the way they think about things have changed. And it comes also to employers. They had to become more flexible and tolerant, you know, with their employees, being open to having employees working remotely. So it's a very interesting perspective. I was having a conversation with some international institutions, and they were telling me that especially in the younger generation, when we are interviewing them, we feel that we are the ones being interviewed, because they ask us, what are the values of your company? Like, how do you deal with your staff? What are the causes that you are investing and you are thinking about, which is a very interesting perspective when we think about the younger generation. So for the sake of time, I think I will ask this question to everyone. So globally, we discussed about how the impact of COVID affected poverty and affected some people more than others, especially we've been mentioning about the vulnerable, the most vulnerable. So in your opinion, what could have been done better? Could have the impact been less on people in terms of their financial security, in terms of their financial resources? And I think I'll start by the order I see on my screen. So I'll start with you, Fatima. You are on mute.
So thank you, Siba, for this important question. I think that we cannot avoid the situation or the pandemic situation and crisis that affected a lot of people, but we can mitigate it, I think so. Based on my experience, I would like to make the focus on the role of financial inclusion and literacy in reinforcing financial capability, particularly of vulnerable population through the development of their skills and behavior. One point that is, in my opinion, very important is the adoption of a holistic approach in the sense that financial literacy, when it is integrated to social and economic programs, could have long-term impact on financial resilience and contribute to the success of these social and economic programs. Indeed, I want to refer to some studies that have proved the positive link between financial literacy and the ability to remain resilient. In general, I think that I'm convinced by that, financially literate people are able to plan better, to save for both emergencies and long-term projects, and expand their will to face shocks and difficulties. On the other side, financially literate business owners, small or medium ones, have more tools to grow their businesses, to diversify risk so as to face also the difficulty and shocks and earn higher returns on their assets by diversifying their assets. Studies revealed also that there is a positive correlation between financial literacy and the use of more complex payment systems, such as digital financial services. I talked about that before. In fact, during the lockdown, the use of mobile or online payment became crucial, both to businesses and households to the mobility restriction. I stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before I move on, I just want to share the result of the poll. So the question was, did COVID-19 affect your job and income or those who are close to you? And 60% responded, yes, it did. So I would like to ask the audience that if they can share with us, how did it affect you? Because we can address this as we are going through the final notes. And I'll move to Dr. Gustavo, if you can share with us your views on the same question.
Yes, thank you. Let me. Could the effects of the pandemics have been avoided? If we look at the magnitude of the impact of poverty, we can hardly think that a shock of this magnitude and the consequences of a shock of this magnitude could have been avoided. Just without trying to intimidate with numbers, but there are. If we look at the numbers of poverty worldwide, the world was doing much better in the years between the years 2015 and 2019, and poverty was decreasing in the world. So while in 2015 there were about 744 million poor, in 2019 the number had been reduced significantly to 655 million. So what happened in 2020 was an increase in the number of poor that brought the world in 1 year to practically the levels of 5 years before. So the number of poor in 2020 was 732, which was much closer to the numbers at the beginning of the period under analysis, 2015, than towards the end of the decade. And the situation in MENA is interesting. In the Arab world, in the MENA countries, poverty was on the rise in the same period. So while poverty worldwide was slowing down, was decreasing, it was increasing in MENA. So what we had after the pandemics was a further increase in poverty, in the number of poor and in the number and in the poverty rates in the Middle East and North Africa region, which takes us to one of the lessons of the COVID-19. So when you had programs in place that were well designed and that were effective, the response to the crisis was better shaped through the upscaling of existing programs. So the situation of those countries that had in place social protection schemes and where saving schemes existed is always going to be easier to address in the case of another shock. If there is another shock and countries are not well prepared, then the situation is going to be significantly different. So this is part of the response. But I also mentioned that the crisis showed some capacity of reaction or response in certain groups more than in others. 50% of the population in the world are in the informal sector, and the Middle East region is a little bit above the average, but it's quite close to the average. Yet we are talking about half of the population not having formal jobs. And these are very vulnerable groups. Some of them are covered by social assistance. The poorest among them are covered by the social assistance, but there is a group, and a very large group in the informal sector that is not necessarily poor. They are just informal. And because they are informal, they are vulnerable without being poor. This is a category that is becoming increasingly more the focus of attention. And it's called the missing middle, because it's a group that will not have pensions because they are not in the formal sector, and will not have social assistance because they are not so poor. So there's an increasing interest in developing countries to try to think of mechanisms to extend social insurance to this missing middle. Some of them have to be with financial inclusion and financial literacy. Unfortunately, I'm a strong supporter of financial inclusion and financial literacy programs, but at the same time, unfortunately, many of these programs have their limitations. I belong to an institution where there is probably the highest concentration of financially educated people. And if you ask many of my colleagues at the World Bank some basic questions about their retirement and their retirement planning, they really do not know too much. And even academics, I mean, this is something I have heard from many academics. You know, the same situation. Mr. Barr, Nicholas Barr, a worldwide authority in pensions, is one who claims knowing quite little about his own personal finances at the time of retirement, while being a worldwide top expert on pensions. And this is a bit of a more complex situation, where sometimes people do not plan their savings well because they do not know enough of personal finances, and there are people who may have PhD in finance but do not take the time to spend you know, some part of their time doing their own personal planning. However, the biggest problem in terms of number, and the biggest challenge, is try to reach those segments of the informal sector which have some savings capacity but need to be channeled in the right instruments, in the proper instruments.
Thank you, Dr. Gustavo. Very valid and important points. So I'll move to you, Sandrine, with the same question, but I will also add to it a question from the audience, which says, what would you say if you are to advise an HR manager on what to do next time should another major strike us?
Okay, big questions. I would say some of the things that maybe I'm going to again respond from maybe an employer and an employee standpoint, be better prepared. I think that what we saw is that companies did not have business continuity planning. Many companies, some of the very large organizations did, but most companies didn't. And it's a fancy name. It's sometimes just as simple as having a list of all the employees with their emergency contact and so on, because, hey, the day that you're sending everybody home, if you don't have a way to contact them, because not everybody has a computer or something like that, what do you do as an employer? So I think that a lot of organizations have learned from that this will be very useful for them. And it's not just from a practical point of view, it's also from a point of view of, from a financial, institutional point of view as a company as well. I think that companies as well have realized that they need to have some kind of cash flow in order to be able to weather, you know, some kind of crisis that might be coming for a reason X or Y. So that's the one thing that maybe hopefully was learned, and that I would say would be one of the first things that I would advise organizations to do. And the other thing, which I think we have not really mentioned that so far, the behavioral economics. So there have been lots of progress made on this topic, and there was a very famous change in the UK, which had a very positive impact for people's savings opportunity, was when in the UK, the enrollment into the second layer of pensions became kind of automated. Instead of asking people, do you volunteer to contribute to a second layer of pension savings, what happened is that most of the organizations had to, by default, enroll employees who then had the opportunity to opt out. And it's called a nudge. It's when an employer or an entity makes, designs a mechanism or a process taking into account, let's say, the best interest of the employee. And in terms of financial stability and how people react to long-term savings, there are lots of those subconscious biases which are actually acting against people's full capacity to plan for the future. You know, like there's an effect called the myopia effect, which means that people can see what's in the near term, but they have a lot of difficulty to project themselves in the future. So they kind of know intellectually that they should save for their pensions, but pensions is going to be a long time. I want to take care of something else, before I need to take care of enrolling my kid to the school or whatever, and they kind of postpone those decisions. So I think it's also something that as employers we should try to figure out. And definitely I would also say, in order to be better prepared nowadays, look into your employee well-being plans as an employer, and really focus on mental well-being and on financial well-being, do a lot of education and so on. It is true that many people have not had any financial education. I graduated from a business school, but nobody in my whole studies ever told me how to create a family budget. And I think those are life skills that the whole world would benefit from learning, adapted to whatever system is available, and practice is available in their own country and community. I can only praise, the efforts of organizations that focus on this kind of financial education. So I think this is what I would say from the employer point of view.
Thank you, Sandrine. And Andrea, so the same question, but I will also add to it a question from the audience. Should financial literacy be mandatory to ensure that all people have clarity and to protect themselves during financial crisis?
Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, that's a clear yes, I would say, to your question. So financial literacy, as I think came out from all of our responses here, that financial literacy, and I love just Sandrine's message that she said, it's a life skill, which is really true. And I also see Gustavo's point that financial literacy, even those who are highly educated, lack the knowledge about how to manage their personal finances, how much to save for retirement, because these are really difficult but also very consequential decisions that we have to make on a daily basis, if you think, and not just during a crisis, also when the economy is doing well and we have record low unemployment rates. These questions are still here, and these questions need to be addressed, and we have to make them. So we are responsible for it. So that's why, yes, financial literacy should be made mandatory, and we can start as early as in schools, right? So, and then go throughout, as Sandrine also mentioned, throughout the entire course of somebody's life, because financial literacy is financial education is most effective, that's what I see in my research, most effective when it's addressing financial decisions that people have to make at that point in time. So if I talk with my students about retirement savings and they are 18, 19 years old, they're saying, oh, that's far along the road. So, well, of course, I will still do it, because compound interest is something that's what's most beneficial, and I call it usually the magic of compound interest to the very youngest, because the young, they have one important asset, and that's time. So their money can grow, and can grow substantially, and that's of course something that I always instill and teach to the students when we talk about retirement savings. So it's really that concept that they have to understand. So that's why I feel financial literacy, financial education is very, very important. But then along our working lives or our lives, we are faced with different other decisions as well. Say, for example, getting a mortgage, buying a house, having our own family, and all the childcare costs that come out of this. So family budget, what you mentioned before, nobody has taught us that. So, and that's actually a mistake. So we have to include that. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And we only have 1 minute, and there's just one question which is addressed to Dr. Gustavo. Is there a World Bank model or scheme template that is adequate for building household financial resilience and protection?
We are not big fans of the one size fits all solutions, but in the context of I would say beyond the COVID crisis, in the context of all the preparedness and discussion about the changing nature of world, the changing nature of work in the world. We have been thinking and proposing a scheme of several levels of income protection. So one is the income protection for the poorest, for those who will probably not be able to develop any savings capacity or participate in a mandatory savings schemes. This is traditionally there has been a separation between the role of the social insurance and the role of the social safety nets. And the social safety nets have been thought as a government financed or public financed mechanism to provide some basic income protection for the poorest. And on the other hand, the social insurance schemes, which may have the form of contributory payroll tax-based schemes or savings schemes for the formal sector workers. And as I said, now there is an increasing concern about what to do with the missing middle, with those who are neither in the extreme poverty group, nor in the group of those who have the privilege, so to say, of having a regular pension scheme. And this group is becoming increasingly larger because the social insurance, we can anticipate that the social insurance is not going to be extended to more people in the future, because the social insurance was conceived for those people who have a regular job during 40 years or 30 years, pay regular contributions to some kind of insurance or savings scheme, and then get a pension at the end of their careers. But these forms of work are disappearing, and we heard from Sandrine, other colleagues have mentioned that many people, will not work in this way for several reasons. One, because these reasons are going to become more scarce. And on the other hand, because many people don't want to work in that way and prefer to have other forms of flexible work. So for flexible work, we have to think differently. And here the role of saving schemes is becoming increasingly important. Some people, when we say these things at the World Bank, some people say, "Oh, the World Bank is again talking about the multi-pillar social protection." It's not exactly the same. I have to say, it's not exactly the same. But we are quite convinced that between the one extreme of solutions for the poorest, which is there's no way but expanding the non-contributory social protection, and the other extreme of those people who have the already well-established, belonging and participation in regular formal pension schemes, there will be some developments that have to be addressed for the people in the informal sector, for those people who will not formalize probably, but can develop some potential of having saving schemes. And we are trying to do some pilots. We are doing some pilots in Africa. We are starting to work on a framework for South Asia. We are working in the GCC countries on developing schemes for the expat workers. So there's a lot of potential for alternative schemes for those groups who are not covered today were not covered 10 years ago and will probably not be covered unless there are customized solutions for them.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And we're at the end of our session. So I wish you all a great day, and I would like to thank Ibrahim for hosting us, and especially for supporting me in moderating this panel, and his whole team for being here and taking up the questions from the audience. And I hope to see you in some other events. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.